was asked to say just like congratulatory words in Hebrew, in English. So I remembered when we had an event here, and it was in English, and we invited someone, and he said, I have difficulties in English, so I said, okay, we'll have to skip. He said, don't worry, I eat in Hebrew. So, but as you can see, there are lots of events near us. There's like one big lecture just in Bar Shira, and there is another event here. But we're delighted you're all here. My name is Yossi Shane. I'm the host as part of our School of Political Science, Government and International Affairs, and my colleague, Dr. Evgeny Klauber, is the architect of everything we are doing. I don't want to take much of your time because there's lots of things here to be done, so I will turn the point just to wish you all fruitful discussions and to turn the mic to Mr. Hasid, please.
Hi, everybody. Thank you very much, Professor Shane. I'm here to present the biographies of our respectful speakers here. And first and foremost, thank you again, Professor Shane. Thank you so much, Evgeny, for helping us in arranging this event, and for the Francis Brody Institute for Applied Diplomacy. And special thanks for the CTBTO, and especially to Mrs. Elizabeth Sadel for assisting with all the arrangements. Thank you so much, Lisa. I'm going to start with the biography of Mr. Patrick Grenard, I'm sorry for butchering your name. It's going to take a few minutes. Okay, so Patrick Grenard, Mr. Grenard is the director of the Division of Administration for the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, the CTBTO. Since March of last year, Mr. Grenard began his career as an officer with the French Naval Hydrographic and Oceanographic Service. From 1998 to 2003, he held the post of Hydroacoustic and Engineering Officer at the CTBTO, and later from 2004 to 2006, became the head operation and maintenance support group in the CTBTO's International Monitoring System, the IMS division. Thereafter, Mr. Grenard returned to France, where he held the post of Chief Anti-Submarine Warfare Systems Group at the Technical Center for Naval Systems in the Ministry of Defense in Toulon. He returned to the CTBTO in 2008, as Chief Engineering and Development Section. From 2013 onwards, he served as Special Assistant to the Executive Secretary for Program and Technical Coordination until he appointed as Director of Administration, where he serves today. Mr. Grenard has over 25 years of experience in systems engineering and management. As commissioned officer and engineer in the French Ministry of Defense, he held various positions involving the design, operation, testing, and evaluation of scientific instrumentation and complex systems in oceanography, geophysics, and underwater warfare. At the CTBTO, he played a leading role in the establishment of the verification system, strategic planning, program coordination, and quality management. Mr. Grenard holds a Master of Science from the Military Academy of Brest in France, and in 2010, he was made Knight of the French National Order of Merit. Thank you, Mr. Grenard. I told you it's going to take some time. Dr. Zoe Levornik is researcher at the National Security Studies Center, the NSSC, at the University of Haifa. Prior to the NSSC, Levornik was a postdoctoral fellow at the Stanton Nuclear Security Program at MIT's Security Study Program. Levornik received her PhD in International Relations from the University of Haifa. Dr. Eitan Barak is a lecturer from the Department of International Relations at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, specialized within the international relations discipline in arms control and disarmament, international security regimes, mainly in the Middle East, and Israel national security policy. Within the international law field, Dr. Barak specializes in the law of weaponry and the law of arms control, and Dr. Barak was my instructor in my thesis, so thank you for that. Dr. Or Rabinovich, she's gonna come in a few minutes. Rabinovich is an academic staff member in the Department of International Relations at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Her research interests include nuclear proliferation and technology, nuclear history, and the Israel-US relations. In 2014, she published a book titled Bargaining on Nuclear Tests at Oxford University Press. She completed a PhD in the Department of War Studies at King's College in London. Today, she's working on reviewing the Israeli nuclear history of establishing nuclear power plants, a research that is supported by Israel Science, the Israeli Science Foundation. Mr. Avri Avital, thank you so much for coming. Mr. Avital is the director for non-proliferation at the policy division of the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission since 2016. Prior to joining the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission, the IAEC, Mr. Avital served at the National Security Council on multiple positions and headed the Non-Proliferation and Arms Control Department. As part of his duties, he is responsible for the policy planning and integration of the Israeli policy regarding the CTBT, attends the CTBT forums and stands in close connection with the Israeli mission to the IAEA and the CTBT Preparatory Committee. And Mr. Yaron Schneider, thank you so much for coming. He's our chairperson for today. Mr. Schneider is a PhD candidate at the Department of International Relations at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the Neubauer Research Associate at the Institute for National Security Studies, the INSS. His PhD thesis is entitled The Triangle of Peacekeeping Operations, States and Non-State Actors as a Framework for Security Governance in Borderlands. Mr. Schneider holds a BA in International Relations, in Arabic Language and Literature, and an MA in International Relations. And in addition, is an Arab Affairs correspondent for TV channels 12 and 13. Thank you all, guys. I won't take any more of your time.
Okay. So good evening, and thank you for joining us. I would like to thank Tel Aviv University and Francis Brody Institute for Applied Diplomacy for hosting this event. And before we start, some quick notes about our plan. Each panel member will have up to 20 minutes for his or her talk or presentation, an additional 10 minutes for answering your questions. Briefly, there will be plenty of ample time for more questions and discussion between the audience and the panel members after the presentations. Also, there will be a short break of 15 minutes for refreshment. It will be between presentations 4 and 5. Please come back on time. At the end of the event, there will be a brief additional presentation given by the Israeli members of the CTPTO Youth Group, the organizer of the event, about the activity of the group, opportunities it offers, and how audience members may join it. So let's begin. Our first speaker is Mr. Patrick Grenard, the director of the Division of Administration for the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization. Please.
So thank you, Yaron, for your kind introduction, and thank you to the members of the CTBTO youth group. So Zoe, Nir, Adi, and Baruchi, who is not here, but was one of the architects of this meeting. So thank you for the initiative to organize today's event. I'd also wish to express my gratitude to the National Security Studies Center of the Haifa University and the School of Political Science, Government and International Relations of the Tel Aviv University for co-hosting it. So dear hosts, dear co-panelists, dear participants, it's a real pleasure for me to be here today, but for at least two reasons. The first one lies in the fact that, as I said earlier, this event is being organized by Israeli members of the CTBTO youth group, the CYG. So you'll hear this acronym several times in my talk. And at CTBTO, we attach a particular importance to the CYG because we believe that education and dialogue is the foundation upon which we need to build our future. The second reason why I'm pleased to be here is that Israel has always extended remarkable support and cooperation to CTBTO. In particular, we have established a strong relationship with the Israel Atomic Energy Commission that I would like to recognize today. Thank you. I look forward to having fruitful discussion with my co-panelists and with all of you. But before we come to that part of the event, I would like to provide you with a brief status update on the CTBT, followed by a few words on its relevance and opportunities for action. And at the end, I would like to highlight the importance of the CTBTO youth group and the objective of this initiative in that global context. The CTBT, as you know, bans all nuclear test explosions. And it is, in the words of former US President Bill Clinton, the longest sought, hardest fought prize in arms control history. Today, the CTBT remains one of the most adhered to arms control instruments in the field. With 184 state signatories and 167 ratifying states, it is nearly universal. What an eloquent illustration of the support that the CTBT enjoys across the globe. We are grateful to all member states for that support, which beyond the respective domestic policy lines emanates from the realization that the CTBT is underpinned by an impartial, credible, and trustworthy science-based verification system capable of monitoring the globe for nuclear test explosions. The verification system of the CTBT gathers seismic, hydroacoustic, infrasound, and radionuclide data around the globe and around the clock. The data are continuously processed by the International Data Center in Vienna, and the data and products are shared in real time, in near real time, with all member states that make the request. Made up of 337 monitoring facilities and 250 communication assets, the system operates at the cutting edge of scientific knowledge and is about 90% complete. But coming back to the primary objective of the CTBT, detecting any potential nuclear test, we can say today that the CTBT has been a success story and is now considered alongside the NPT as a core element of the global nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament regime. The verification regime once more demonstrated its robustness and reliability by detecting with precision all the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, DPRK, announced nuclear test and provided to member states raw and reviewed data in a timely manner and within treaty deadlines. The capability of the international monitoring system is continuously improving, and its performance is beyond initial expectations. You can judge by yourself. In 2006, only 22 IMS stations were used to detect and locate the first announced nuclear test by DPRK. And the location of the event was within an error ellipse of 880 square kilometers. If we look at the last test in September 2017, 122 stations were used to locate the event and really allowed us to narrow down the test area down to 109 square kilometers, well within the 1,000 square kilometers that the treaty mandates for an on-site inspection. So we deliver on our promises. And what is equally remarkable with the CTBT is that all states are on an equal footing, same obligations, same rights. So it's a very democratic treaty. When complete with the on-site inspection leg, the system will represent the most sophisticated verification regime ever envisaged. That component of the verification system has also made substantial progress in recent years with 2 integrated field exercises IFE 2008 and IFE 2014, which proved the readiness of the organization to carry out an on-site inspection and establish a major benchmark for its application. In short, we can state that by all measures, we have built a deterrent by demonstrating that the treaty is verifiable through a global monitoring system that is unique, reliable, and efficient. The CTBT is one of the measures around which an effective international consensus can be built, because it is a tried and tested instrument for non-proliferation, a catalyst for nuclear disarmament, and a strong confidence and security building measure. And that is not the end of the story. In fact, the value of the CTBT goes even beyond the verification that no states are undertaking a nuclear test. There is a wide range civil, scientific, and industrial applications of CTBT data in areas such as disaster risk reduction and environmental monitoring. The treaty is a veritable scientific cornucopia, a horn of plenty. Whether it is to detect earthquakes and to provide real-time warnings of tsunamis, to track severe storm systems, or radiation dispersal from nuclear accidents, or advance the study of meteorology, climate change, and ocean life, CTBT data potentially offers a unique and invaluable contribution to the sustainable development. The capability of the international monitoring system for civil application was once again illustrated very recently during the search of the missing Argentinian submarine, the Ara San Juan, which was found nearly a year after it had lost contacts in the vicinity of where an impulsive event had been detected by two hydroacoustic stations of the international monitoring system. And one of those stations were more than 6,000 kilometers away from the event. So it really gives you a clear illustration of the capability and sensitivity of the system. We are really pleased that the effectiveness, the maturity, and the potential of the CTBT verification regime was recognized by the first ever resolution of the United Nations Security Council on the CTBT. That's a resolution 2310 that was adopted at the time of the 20th anniversary of the CTBT in 2016. But despite these achievements, and even though the current global context serves as a constant reminder of the threat posed by nuclear weapons, as you know, the treaty has not entered into force. So now let's take a look at the global context. At a time where the non-proliferation and disarmament regime is facing daunting difficulties characterized by an increasingly competitive notion of national security, there is a risk that short-term gains may be favored over more strategic global long-term benefits. This situation is compounded by accelerated scientific and technical progress, a growing expansive trend to include nuclear energy in domestic energy mixes, and a proliferation of non-state actors in many areas of tensions or conflicts. While the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty has worked reasonably well since its inception, preventing a number of states from acquiring nuclear arms and preventing massive spread of nuclear weapons, the world remains faced with serious nuclear proliferation crisis. The disappointment generated by the outcome, or rather the lack of outcome, of the last NPT review conference is being translated into policy initiatives, for instance, discussions on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, the Nuclear Weapon Ban Treaty. While these initiatives might give a new impetus to global disarmament and non-proliferation efforts, dividing lines are appearing at the preparatory commission between proponents and opponents of the Nuclear Ban Treaty. Some member states recently tabled the idea that there should be some conditionality to fully benefiting from the international monitoring system data in the international data center products. Conditionality based on level of commitment to CTBT, i.e. its ratification. In that context, maintaining the status quo in the CTBTO Preparatory Commission cannot be an option. What is needed in such times is tangible progress and utmost unity of purpose of the international community in order to restore trust backed by an effectively verifiable regime. And for that, we should not miss any opportunity to demonstrate the relevance of the CTBT. Let me now highlight 5 of these opportunities. The NPT 2020 REFCON, confidence buildings in the Middle East, regional cooperation, DPRK, denuclearization, and science diplomacy. Starting with the NPT, tangible progress in nuclear disarmament at the 2020 NPT Review Conference is a must. And the CTBT is the low-hanging fruit that gathers wider and stronger support, and it's the easiest to implement, to really bring tangible results. It gathers more support because the CTBT was the lowest common denominator for virtually all member states at the last NPT REFCON and continues to enjoy wide support as recently demonstrated in international conferences. Now, if we look at the region, the CTBT could be instrumental in providing a basis for transparency and confidence building. We really need to draw the lessons from Syria's adherence to the Chemical Weapon Convention and the conclusion of the JCPOA that were indeed positive steps, but also missed opportunities for the CTBT. The principal regional actors, Egypt, Iran, and Israel, have all signed the CTBT. By doing so, they have already said no to nuclear testing. CTBT ratification by all states in the region would turn this no into a never and establish a de facto nuclear test-free zone in the Middle East that could constitute a catalyst for the weapon of mass destruction-free zone. But there are opportunities for regional cooperation. I'd like to recall 2 major events that showed a strong involvement of Israel and really fostered this regional cooperation. I was recalling with colleagues at the National Data Center the 2011 SIREM experiment when a 90-ton calibration explosion was set off in the Negev desert. It was detected by IMS stations as far as 6,000 kilometers. 90 ton, 6,000 kilometers in Mongolia. And by infrasound portable infrasound arrays that had been deployed in neighboring countries. There was an international workshop held in Eilat just after the experiment where scientists could share a result of the experiment. Scientific results were published in peer-reviewed journal. So the experiment truly enabled to advance the infrasound monitoring science and to highlight the benefit of regional cooperation. Another example is the on-site inspection integrated field exercise, IFE-14, that was held in 2014 in Jordan, which demonstrated that the CTBT can act as a conduit for technical engagement and cooperation among states in the Middle East. It was truly a demonstration of power. A 30-day-long field exercise in Jordan, 15 out of the 17 on-site inspection techniques tested, 364 participants from 50 countries in that event that took place on the other side of the Dead Sea. 150 tons of equipment shipped to Jordan. Israel made a major contribution to the event and to the success of IFE-14, also by hosting a debriefing workshop in April 2015. Another opportunity, as I mentioned, is the denuclearization process in the DPRK. DPRK being the only country that has challenged the nuclear no-test norm in the 21st century. And after its announced decision on 24th of May this year to suspend nuclear tests and to shut down the nuclear test site at Penguiri, we believe that the international community should not miss here an opportunity to make a strong case for the CTBT. First of all, we will all agree that the best way that DPRK can cement renunciation to nuclear testing by making it irreversible is by a signature and ratification of the CTBT. Second, when it comes to closing down a test site, the CTBTO has developed expertise, technology, capability that could contribute, if requested and if mandated by our member states, to the verification of the permanent closure of the test site. So beyond remote measurement capabilities, in-field measurement techniques could be implemented to perform a site characterization survey that could provide a baseline of the current state of the site for future verification purpose. Just one example of where our capability could be deployed. Now moving to science and diplomacy. The CTBT is at the nexus between science and diplomacy. In that regards, there are opportunities to maintain and promote at the same time the scientific and the political relevance of the organization. The upcoming Science and Technology Conference 2019 that will take place in Vienna from 24 to 28 June 2019 is one of those opportunities. As the 7th event in a series that has now become what is called the maker of the verification science and conference, it is an opportunity and for scientists, technologists, academics, and students, policymakers to explore innovative approaches to enhance the capabilities of the treaty's verification regime, as well as to help move the treaty closer to universalization and entry into force. We registered more than 1,000 participants at the last conference, and we expect at least the same level for the next one, and I really would encourage you to participate. Now moving back to the CYG. As you know, the paradox with the CTBT is that since the verification regime is working really well, its entry into force may be perceived as not being urgent anymore. Where should we move to ratification? Where should we move to entry into force? If there is a test in the DPRK, then the CTBTO will detect and share the information. So we have so far reviewed opportunities to showcase the relevance of the CTBT, but to avoid such a situation, there is a need to revitalize the discussion on the treaty. As I said at the beginning, this event has particular relevance in that respect, and because we attach great importance to the CTBTO youth group. The CYG was launched in 2016 to promote knowledge transfer to the next generation of leaders. Ever since, the CYG has transformed into a robust platform to build peer-to-peer relationship and much-needed dialogue, facilitating an understanding of the CTBT, its verification regime, and the benefits it provides. This is what we are doing here. So again, I'm really happy to be part of this dialogue. The youth group makes a difference. It makes a difference to give young people a seat at the table when important decisions are to be made. It effectively helps to close the divide between generations that negotiated the arms control and non-proliferation treaties and the next generation of scientists and diplomats who will be writing and advocating for future arms control measures. And this is really where we need the help of the youth group, and to continue to carry the message that something needs to be done on the CTBT, that the status quo is not an acceptable option. In conclusion, I would like to stress that while the tools at our disposal have become more numerous and innovative, there is really no sustainable alternative to multilateralism based on trust through verification. The value of the CTBT verification regime has become more and more evident. What is needed is strong leadership, with the ultimate message to all being optimism driven by goodwill shall prevail over pessimism dictated by reason. I thank you all for your attention and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any questions from the audience for Patrick? Okay, so we'll have, as I said, ample of time for questions at the end of our panel. So the next speaker will be Dr. Zoe Levornik, fellow at the National Security Studies Center at the University of Haifa, and CTBTO youth group member. Please.
Thank you very much. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about the normative power of arms control treaties, or to put it differently, the power of arms control treaties to establish and strengthen norms. As we know, there's a dual significance to arms control treaties. There's first the obvious practical significance of limiting and reducing weapons and weapon systems, placing safeguards and monitoring the transfer of supplies, of knowledge, of technology. But there's also another aspect that is perhaps often overlooked, which is institutionalizing international norms, which means we take an abstract idea and we turn it into practice. And both these aspects are part of the non-proliferation regime and are necessary for a strong non-proliferation regime. Now, the effect or the importance of the effect of norms is often dismissed, especially in the international relations field. Usually when I talk about the importance of norms, there's always at least one person that ends up getting up and saying, norms. What's really important in the end is a military power, it's economic power. Norms are often regarded as something that is at best marginal. States will comply with norms if it suits them. It's not really significant, it doesn't really have a meaningful effect. I think part of that perception is because, at least in our daily personal life, we are so taken for granted the compliance to norms that we don't realize how much they affect our behavior. But the fact is, if norms didn't exist, if they didn't have an effect, half of you here will be sitting in bathing suits and the other half in prom dresses. The reason you knew what you should wear to this event today when you came here is because of norms, because you were socialized according to certain codes of behavior, and you know how to behave appropriately in different social situations. Without norms in our daily life guiding us, every single activity and behavior that we do not know how to be and act in society. This is not less important for states. Perhaps it's even more important because in the international system, we do not have a government that can regulate and enforce rules to the extent that we have within a state. So norms regulate state behavior. If we had to use any form of force in order to get states to act in a certain way, our international system, our states will be bankrupt. You cannot use force every time you want to get states to comply. So norms are actually very significant in international relations. The non-proliferation norm is a great example of a norm that's been institutionalized in numerous arms control and disarmament treaties. The NPT, the INF, START 1, 2, SWORD, there's so many, there's no time to actually list them. And this is important because these treaties actually give a political and even legal bounding to the norm. It's unfortunate that we're actually now seeing the US, for example, kind of backtracking on important treaties because it should actually be fighting to preserve those treaties and strengthen them, not break away from these important treaties that are part of the regime. Because the non-proliferation regime relies on a strong non-proliferation norm. Carrots and sticks are a short-term solution, but if we want to see long-term compliance, we need states to internalize the non-proliferation norm. Well, the non-proliferation norm was largely successfully internalized in the West. We see general public and political support. It's true that sometimes the political support is only on the level of rhetorics and not action, but that still shows that there's a recognition, at least, of the significance of ideas of non-proliferation and disarmament and arms control. The norm has been less successfully internalized outside of the West in regions like the Middle East. There are two main reasons why this is so. I'm going to discuss this briefly. If anyone is interested, we can discuss it further in the Q&A. The first reason is many regions like the Middle East, like South Asia, have a long history of colonialization, of foreign intervention, and anything that is perceived as foreign intervention, as something from the outside, is often immediately rejected. There's a perception within the Middle East, as in other regions, that the non-proliferation norm and regime, they are a form of new colonialization. It's a way for the Western powers to once again keep non-Western states weak and submissive. There's arguments that this is an unjust and there's a double standard to the regime because it allows certain states to have nuclear weapons but not other states. So there's kind of a rejection of these ideas as coming from the West, coming from outside, and trying to actually take something away from non-Western states. The other reason is, in order for a norm to actually be successfully internalized, we need diffusion of ideas. People need to be able to cooperate, to talk, to work together in order for those ideas to spread and take hold. This existed in the West because there was, you know, a lot of cooperation in civil movements and organizations. It does not exist to that extent in the Middle East because there's a lot of hostility between the states and the West. So there was a lack of the ability to actually spread these ideas and create cooperation that will lead to the diffusion of the norm. This is, again, very unfortunate because more than ever now, with recent development in the Middle East, the region is in dire need of norms of arms control and disarmament, and also nuclear safety culture, which is also missing in a region that we see more and more states interested in developing at least an infrastructure of nuclear capability. So those things are lacking and are necessary. And treaties in general can be helpful in this area because they provide an opportunity for cooperation, for education, for discourse, for confidence building measures, as we just heard. And in the case of the CTBT, this is probably the best way, the place to start, because this is a less problematic treaty. We mentioned it's a low-hanging fruit. Even for Israel, it was able to sign the treaty. It's only been not ratified by 3 states in the region, and that also there's hope there. It's not something that cannot be resolved with some efforts. Another reason why this is a good place to start is because this specific treaty allows for a lot of active participation. Again, we heard that there's an organization, there's activity, there's a youth group, there's a lot of opportunities for people to meet and cooperate and learn and talk. And these are the necessary first steps to take in order to establish norms of arms control in the region. It's also a flexible treaty, which can allow for regional activity, because as I mentioned, it's really important that whatever ideas, they will come locally from the region and not from the outside, because anything from the outside is probably going to be rejected. Excuse me, getting over a cold. So this is a great opportunity actually for starting this small steps towards a greater norm. And as we know, in the Middle East, it's always tiny steps towards progress. It's never something that is very comprehensive or very advanced, but the CTBTO can be the first step towards something greater, something larger in the Middle East. So thank you very much.
Any questions to Zoe? Fine. So we'll go next to our next speaker, which is Dr. Eitan Barak, Professor of International Relations at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Switch off the lights.
So first I want to thank Neil, my student, for inviting me. When your student invite you, you do everything that you can to come, and it's an honor for me. And I would like to show you the question of the feasibility of Israel to join the CWC. Of course, it's not an official position. It's my view. But first, let's see the situation regarding the universality in the Middle East. So, currently, meaning December 2018. So, currently we have 167 notifications, but in the Middle East, in the traditional definition of the Middle East, we have three states that signed but have yet to ratify, which is Egypt, Israel, and Yemen. Egypt and Israel are much more important, of course, than Yemen because they are part of the 44 states that their ratification is needed in order to the treaty to enter into effect, okay, into force. And if we use the greater Middle East definition, we also have Iran. And the problem is that Egypt and Iran, in fact, make sure that their ratification is contingent in Israel accession to the NPT. Okay, the same thing happens regarding the Chemical Weapon Convention, in which the Arab decided on the linkage approach, which link nuclear weapons to chemical weapons. At the time, they even had a formal decision in the Arab League in September 1992, saying that they are boycotting the Chemical Weapon Convention unless Israel commit itself to join the NPT. Eventually, except Egypt, all Arab states have already joined the treaty. But this is a new thing. So, we have also two states in the Middle East that have not even signed, which is Syria and Saudi Arabia. Egypt should host a station, but there's not even agreement. And Iran has a station, but in 2007 it suspended the communication with the headquarters. So this is a situation currently. And the feasibility. First, and this is, in fact, you will see the crux of the matter. Already in January 1964, Israel joined the Limited Test Ban Treaty, or the Partial Test Ban Treaty. Europe and US have a different name. Israel has done it because of also to mitigate the American pressure, but the point is that this agreement, under international law, only underground tests are therefore permitted for Israel. Okay? Because the agreement forbids any test in the outer space, underwater, or in the atmosphere, and implicitly allow underground test. However, and this is the crux of the matter, in September 1969, I think in 23, we have the important meeting between Golda Meir, the then Israel Prime Minister, and Nixon, the then President of the United States, in which, in fact, they formalized the Nixon-Meir understanding. Tacit understanding, according to Israel, in fact, committed itself not to conduct nuclear tests. In fact, Israel committed itself not to advertise its nuclear weapons. So it's not only nuclear tests, but not to blackmail and so on. In return, of course, the United States promised something very important. And why this is close to the matter? Because it means that, in essence, the treaty is simply formalizing Israel's bilateral understanding of the United States. Okay? Even if Israel, let's say, withdraw from its signature, Israel signed the CTBT in September 1996, even though Israel is forbidden from conducting any nuclear test unless it's violated or United States gives permission and so on. And of course, this is so important to Israel because this is the only thing that in fact prevents the international community from dismantling the Israeli nuclear arsenal. In September 1996, Israel signed the CTBT. Signing has a legal meaning. A state that has signed, it means its obligation to refrain from acts that will defeat the treaty's object and purpose. Unless, of course, it makes clear its intention to withdraw from the treaty or things like that. What Israel, for example, has done with the Rome Statute regarding the International Criminal Court, okay, in which we sent letter. So, in any case, currently Israel is forbidden from any nuclear test. So, from now we will see various reservations that Israeli diplomats raise in all the various fora. They are important, but the message is that ratification will not endanger Israel's security. It's more a case of politics. And I'm sure that maybe the diplomat will object. Then Israel, after signing, Israel has the opportunity to be involved in formulation and all the verification procedure. And Israel play an active role throughout the negotiation stage. Not surprisingly, Israel found itself with states like Pakistan, China, that strove and seek minimal intrusiveness, as opposed to the United States and other Western states that want much more intrusiveness. Israel is always afraid of that. In general, Israel's policy regarding arms control in the past was alienation. There is so many arms control treaties that Israel prevent from signing, even they are not endangering Israel and so on. Like, for example, stationing nuclear weapons in the sea, things like that. Israel also, as part of the cooperation, Israel has conducted a series of course, conventional explosions starting from 1999. Maybe there was even after 2011. The first one, for example, just to show you the openness, Israel invite observers from Jordan, from Egypt. I think that the Egyptians didn't arrive eventually, and Russia and United States. And here they have even 100 tons. And maybe there was another series that I missed. That's one thing. Israel hosts two seismic auxiliary stations, one in Mount Meron and one in Eilat, and they are active. Israel should receive compliment from the CTBTO, and of course a laboratory in Sorek nuclear reactor, which is open for the public, by the way. In June 2016, Netanyahu stated that Israel would ratify the treaty at some point in the future, depending upon the regional context and the appropriate timing. The context of this statement was a 40 minutes meeting with the with Dr. Levisa Zerbo, if I pronounce his yes, Lesina, from Burkina Faso. He visited Israel and he met with Netanyahu, and he himself was interviewed and he said that he thinks it will be within 5 years. So now 2 years have elapsed, but we will see. Yet, there are three main considerations regarding ratification were raised. And what I've done here, I've taken an article which published here in Strategic Assessment by Alon Bar. Alon Bar is a senior diplomat. At the time, he was deputy director for strategic affairs in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And he published an article in which he, in fact, based on all the statements that were given in the annual conference to facilitate the entry into force of the CTBT, he, in fact, summarized the Israel reservation regarding ratification, which are all eventually are surmountable. Okay? And that's a good thing. It's not the NPT, which is dead end. First, Israel was afraid, the same as in the CWC, from possible views of on-site inspection. Because there is a procedure under the treaty to inspect, and then there is problem of secrecy and so on. However, first, there is a requirement regarding the source of info which will trigger the inspection. You cannot just say, I have information from some organization, some agent, because all the means of information should be legal. Whether it's NTM, meaning National Technical Means, or whether it's info from the system, or even together, but it has to be legal. You cannot say, I have information, I don't want to reveal it, it's from a secret agent in Israel, and he said that Israel conducted a nuclear test. And this case of abuse is sensitive because Israel's geographical position is problematic. And already in November 1995, there was a small earthquake, I think in Eilat region, even much south in Nueva, and Libya claimed that Israel conducted a nuclear test, which of course was rubbish, but second, and this is more important, as opposed to the CWC, the so-called green light procedure was chosen, meaning in order to initiate such an inspection, you need 31 affirmative vote out of 51 members. Okay, in the OPCW, for example, you need 2/3 from the 41 to block it. So it's not easy to have 30 members that will support inspection in Israel while they think it's not based on things like that. And second, there is punitive measures may be imposed on the requesting member in case of rejection, that they will think that it's abusive nature. He can be suspended from the executive council. He even, the state could even be forced to pay all the cost of the inspection. And the last thing is that the record of the CWC challenge inspection. The challenge inspection in the CWC, it's amazing. You can have hundreds of people within a day. So at the time when the CWC entered into force in 1997, there was much talking in Israel. Much work was done about challenge inspection. Do you know how many challenge inspections have been conducted since the entry into force in April 1997? 0. So much talk, so much, but however, Alon Bar said, yes, I know that there was 0. He wrote his article in 2010, but it's only because we are not there. Meaning political reason prevent challenge inspection, but this political consideration will be responsible to inspection, abuse inspection in Israel. I personally, giving the CWC challenge inspection record, I don't think that it should be problematic, but because the treaty address such a concern in a proper way. But this one, they raise it. Second, and this is maybe more important, not like the third consideration, equal status in the treaty institution. And here Israel receives a huge candy, which does not exist in other international fora that I'm familiar with. Israel is they divided the question who will sit in the Executive Council. They divided the world into 6 groups, according to region. And Israel lies in the Middle East and South Asia group. Okay? There are 26 members in that group, if I remember correctly. And what's happened is that first the group, in fact, and this is Israel complaint, and it's completely proper, right? It's non-operational. It's existing paper. This is because Iran is refusing to have any meeting with Israel. So nothing happened with the group, but maybe the CTBT representative could shed more light on it. However, unlike other international bodies, slowly but surely, Israel will serve in the Executive Council. We have never been in the Security Council, for example, as far as I remember. But here we will be. How? Because they decide what's happening in all this group, in all this arms control treaty. The group never choose Israel. So, but here there's a provision saying that beside all the members that will be elected by either rotation or election, each group will send one according to alphabetical order. So one day Israel will be, and in fact 7, because Israel starts with I, 7 states are before Israel. So I think that within the 3rd decade we will be in the Executive Council. It's very hard to see such thing happens in other fora. But the group is not operational. And here, this is the most important, I will say, arena or field of concern, and this is the regional one. Even Netanyahu, in fact, hint that this is the most important one. And it's the same apply to the Chemical Weapons Convention. First, Bar say that the overall regional atmosphere has been changed, I will say even dramatically, since the mid-90s in which Israel signed. Israel at the time signed the CWC in January 1993, and then it signed this one. Then it was a regional optimism. There was the negotiation with the Palestinian territory. Israel had at that time new representation in Arab states, and there was hope of regional normalization. And now, if I look back on Bar 2010 and even now, the situation has not dramatically changed. As you know, we have the Russian involvement in Syria, limit Israel action. We have the heavy involvement of Hezbollah, not only in Lebanon, but now in Syria as well. And nothing seemed more happier than 2010. So that's a problem. Second, Israel wants to see Iran and Egypt ratification. But of course, this is what leads to the deadlock, because Iran and Egypt wants not only Israel ratification, but Israel accession to the NPT. And Egypt, by the way, is one of the 3 states that not even signed the CWC. Okay? All the world is member of the CWC besides 4 states. Israel that signed but has yet to ratify, and 3 states that not even signed, South Sudan, North Korea, and Egypt. And because Egypt orchestrated the policy of boycotting the CWC unless Israel commit itself to join the NPT. So, second, Israel say, what about Iran's and Egypt ratification? Third reservation within this regional concern is that even after their ratification, Iran, Libya, and Syria, all these 3 states were found to have seriously violated their NPT obligation. And so, okay, so they joined the treaty. Even if they joined the treaty, they could cheat. So, possible violation of the CTBT as well. Of course, it's a problematic because first you want them to ratify, but said even if they ratify, they can cheat. Right? It's always happen. And Bar point on the, he said, let's look on the NPT review conference in 2000 when there is a final document, and go back 10 years after, and 3 states have found during that decade to in violation of the NPT provision. However, out 5 in the treaty, in fact, empower the conference to revoke violent rights under the treaty, recommend punitive measure, for example, sanction, or bring the case to the UN attention. UN, not UN Security Council, UN attention. So it's addressed, but not completely. And last but not least, Bar say Israel enemy are able to withdraw from the treaty. The treaty has a provision which allows for withdrawal. This provision has no legal meaning, meaning even if there is no provision that allows a state to withdraw from the treaty, every state has an inherent right to withdraw from a treaty which jeopardizes its supreme interest. The same that Article 51 at the UN Charter regarding self-defense is not the source for the right to self-defense. Even states that are not part of the UN have a right to defend themselves. Right, for any treaty you can withdraw, but it's very rare. United States withdraw from the ABM treaty in 2002. North Korea withdraw from the NPT in 2003. And it's hard to find another example. It's still a step with dramatic implication. What I think main obstacle, of course, my estimation, first is use policy toward the treaty. As you know, the CTBT, it failed in the Senate in October 1999, humiliation for the Clinton administration. Obama spoke that he will raise the issue and is counting skulls, but eventually nothing happens. As long as United States is not joining the treaty, it is hard for Israel to do so. I don't see Trump joining that treaty. Not now, but at the beginning there was even articles in Haaretz that officials say that privately they cannot do it against the US will and so on. Israel tried to coordinate its policy with the United States when it's come to arms control. Sometimes there was even a case that they changed the voting in the hall at the very last minute, because suddenly it turned out that the United States wants a new position. And rightly, the United States is Israel's patron and our strongest ally. And second thing, and this is, I think, should be less in the CTBT, it's more pronounced and strong in the consideration regarding the ratification of the CWC, is the slippery slope. Okay, let's say that Israel ratified the treaty and everybody allude and happy. Should it invite more pressure regarding the NPT? Israel is under huge attack to join the NPT. Every review conference in fact, failed or succeed because of Israel. Okay? The only thing that prevent a failure of the 2010 review conference was the fact that Obama administration surrendered to pressure and agreed to decision against Israel. So if it will increase the Arab appetite and say, let's push more on Israel, and we will be able to achieve in diplomatic way what we never able to achieve in military way, then it's a wrong steps. But I think that, on the contrary, these steps could show that Israel is doing some goodwill steps, and it's even mitigate the pressure, and in fact it also may undermine Israel's declared policy to object to global arms control treaty, because Israel, the traditional policy was that global arms control regime are not fit for Israel. Israel is in a special region full of conflict and history of cheating, and there should be tailor-made region for Israel. And suddenly, if we join global arms control and so on, so what's wrong with the NPT? What's wrong with IEA inspection? But there is advantage. First, two advantages. In fact, Lassina has raised in his interview. He said Israel will have more info, right? But since all the Arab states are already members of the NPT, and it's not, and Israel has its own advanced NTM, National Technical Means, I don't provide it with much value. I don't give it too much value. And second, making Israel less isolated in the international community. I think we should agree with him. However, it may be useful vis-a-vis the Arab traditional political attack, especially Egypt, which attacked Israel in every forum regarding the nuclear arena. On Israel's stance regarding arms control of the WMD, you can be able to say to Egypt, why, what happened with you? The same that we attacked them, that they are not yet ratified the Rotanga, the Panandima, sorry. However, the substantial advantage, and this is the important thing, but this advantage is long range, it's regional and it's for the long range. In May 2010, in fact, the review conference of the NPT decided to convene an international conference in 2002 on the establishment of Middle East WMD free zone. Okay? Luckily, eventually, nothing happened in 2002 because the Arab Spring erupted and Israel was saved, because there was the question whether the groom will arrive to the conference. However, while it is unlikely that Israel will forego its nuclear capability in the foreseeable future, regardless if someone is from the right wing or the left wing, because it's considered an important one for Israel survival. And by the way, it's also enable peace agreement. I know that it sound maybe strange, but the fact that decision makers in Israel know that even in the black days, they will have this capability, enable them to have more, to be able to have more consciousness regarding territorial and things like that. But you can disagree. So, but there are some clear steps to be taken by all states invited to the conference. And these steps could, without endangering Israel's security, to serve as a major confidence and security building measure. And those become, I think, the cornerstone for the establishment of Middle East weapon of mass destruction. And what are these period steps suggested? In three arena. First is the nuclear one. And in the nuclear one, as I perceive it, joining the CTBT is an important one. I go back to 1990. At the time, there was a very in-depth and famous UN research regarding the establishment of nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East, what should be done and what steps could promote it. And in that study, they say about commitment not to conduct nuclear tests, but to give substance to Israel's policy of not introducing nuclear weapons into the region. So, in fact, maybe a membership at the treaty will be Israel's nuclear litmus test. A second step in that is that, and I will just mention it because it's not connected to our direct subject, is a consent to a proposed fissile material cut of treaty. Of course, given that tritium supply will be provided, but we won't discuss it right now. And even a step that Israel rejected in the past in various fora, a regional no first use commitment. It could be the form, whether treaty, final document, things like that, is less important. No first use commitment is the same thing that China has declared once it conducted its first nuclear test on October 16, 1964, saying that under no circumstance China would employ nuclear weapons. So nuclear weapons become only as a deterrent. In the chemical arena, Israel could ratify the CWC. There is no real reason not to do it, and that's why even senior official in the security apartment in Israel is supporting it. But of course, diplomat issue and so on, and the slippery slope, which is because it's related to the future, no one could decide what side, who is right, who is wrong. And in the biological arena, Israel may accede to the BWC. In fact, beside South Sudan, which is a new state, it was established in July 2011, Israel is the only state in the world that is not member of any of the three treaties, major treaties dealing with WMD. Okay? It's not such a honor. So in sum, I tend to agree with Messina that ratification will have a little negative effect on Israel's security. Do not confuse between security and diplomatic maneuver or thing like that, but would be a serious step towards showing goodwill on arms control. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Are there any questions or remarks for Ethan right now? Yes.
So thank you, Ethan, for this very well structured and clear presentation. I just wanted to make two comments and to answer one of the questions that you asked during your presentation. First of all, regarding the abuse of the on-site inspection mechanism, you clearly explained that there are countermeasures in the treaty with the green light mechanism and so on. There's one I wanted to add to this, which is the consultation and clarification process in the treaty. That is extremely important.
But it's not mandatory. It's not mandatory. There's a recommendation, strong recommendation.
Well, it's part of the verification regime. It's part of the elements of the verification.
As far as I've read the treaty, as a lawyer, it's not mandatory.
Well, again, that's a discussion that should take place in the executive council. But you know, as the international monitoring system is a tool, and to bring data, to bring evidence in support of a case for on-site inspection, consultation and clarification should also be a tool that can be invoked or not, but it's a tool, at least in the treaty and at the disposal. Then how it is used, and it's another issue. But as part of the consultation and clarification process, there is an important provision in the treaty for what is called cooperative national facilities. So these are facilities that are provided by member states of the organization. They are not part of the international monitoring system. They are not supposed to send data continuously and to be part of the IDC, International Data Center bulletins. But however, in the case of a consultation and clarification, we could tap data from those facilities that need to meet the IMS requirements. So they have to be up to the standards of the other stations in the international monitoring system, but then you can tap data from those stations to supplement and complement the analysis of the IMS. So again, it's another way to feed data in the consultation and clarification process and to avoid discussion, for instance, about a particular event. If suddenly you can bring all those cooperating national facilities, it gives much more insight into the nature of the event and could help to defend against a frivolous or abusive case of on-site inspection. And regarding cooperating national facility, this is a concept that's been, I guess, introduced and supported by Israel. And for a long time, what I want to share with you is that we have recently made progress on this issue. We signed the first agreement for prototype cooperating national facility with Italy 2 years ago. So this is the first prototype CNF that we have in the system, and we have started to work with this. We are currently under negotiation with Cyprus for another agreement. So meaning that we are making progress on this issue, which is a way to bring more data to complement a solution that is provided by the IMS. And that would help with the possible abuse of on-site inspection. Now to your question on the equal status of Israel in treaty institution. Indeed, Israel is a member of the MESA group as defined in the CTBT, and the MESA group is dysfunctional in the preparatory commission. But there is a distinction between the MESA group in the preparatory commission and the MESA group in the treaty. And what matters is the MESA group as defined in the treaty with all the obligations that come with the treaty. Anything that's happened in the preparatory commission is based on rules of procedures that have been established at the Commission, but this is not exactly what is meant to be by the treaty. So first of all, there's a distinction to be made between the preparatory nature of the organization and what should happen once the treaty has entered into force. And then to complement what you mentioned about Israel having a seat by definition, because there is a rotation mechanism in the membership to the Executive Council. There is another possibility to get a seat in the Executive Council that is based on the contribution that a member state is making, or a state party is making to the organization, that is based on the financial contribution, based on the data that are provided from the international monitoring system facilities. Israel has 3 facilities, as you highlighted, that are all certified and well functioning. And also the other parameter is the expertise that a particular country brings, and the relevance of the expertise to nuclear test monitoring, and I believe that Israel is well placed and fully participates in the activities of the Commission. So that's another reason why Israel would be in a position to fully participate in the Executive Council. So beyond the normal rotation mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions? Fine. So we can continue, and the next speaker will be Dr. Or Rabinovich, Professor of International Relations at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Please.
One second, I'll just have my presentation up. I'll angle myself here. My name is Laura. I'm assistant professor at the International Relations Department at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. I mainly work on nuclear proliferation and nuclear history issues. This talk today, I think it's probably going to be shorter because some of the points I wanted to make were already made, so it's fine. I'm going to touch a little bit on the issue of the city beauty and the role of nuclear tests in the international arena, and more specifically as one of the building blocks of the NPT. And we're going to talk a little bit about diplomatic history and the cases of Pakistan and South Africa, and more briefly about the cases of Israel. From a methodological point of view, I'd like to explain where I'm approaching this research from. So mainly, you can say that I'm a closeted sorry, no good? Okay, microphone. Okay, let's see how this goes. Can I use one of the mobile ones, do you think? Yes.
If it's long enough, yeah.
Sorry, guys. We need to switch this one off, maybe? Not 100% sure. I think there's some feedback, a feedback loop going on. Maybe we can... I'm sorry, guys. Sorry for that. Okay, everything is a go. Methodologically speaking, I'm a closeted historian. What I do is I traipse around archives, mainly in English-speaking countries. So the US, South Africa, which is super interesting, some Canada and some British archives as well, and I have research assistants also gathering material in the Indian archives. Most of the statements I'm going to go through in this presentation appear in two previous publications. One of them is a book I published in 2014, and the other is an article which summarized some of the main arguments and built on them, which came out in 2015. And I also did some interviews, though it's not the primary methodology which I use. Most of the statements you'll see here are documents. Let's start. So tests were not initially central to the NPT, and it's very interesting to try and trace the role they played when the NPT was gradually being negotiated before it was even called the NPT. I'm going to start with a draft that was titled Nuclear Non-Proliferation Agreement from December 10th, 1962, which the US representatives gave the Soviet representatives at the time. Interestingly enough, it does not resemble the draft we know, not the draft, the treaty we know these days. The possessing countries were referred to by name, namely France, UK, US, and the USSR. They're not referred to as countries who possess nuclear weapons, they're just stated by their name. The other countries, which we know today in the NPT as the non-nuclear weapon countries, are not referred to as such by name. I'm going to actually read out the quote. It says, the governments of France, the UK, and Northern Ireland, and the US and the USSR solemnly declare that they will not transfer any nuclear weapons directly or indirectly through military alliance into the national control of individual states not now possessing such weapons, and that they will not assist such other states in the manufacture of such weapons. The other signatory governments solemnly declare that they will not manufacture nuclear weapons. So interesting enough, if you follow this definition, you'll see that nuclear tests do not play a role at this stage in the formation of the regime and the relevant bloc regarding nuclear tests. From 66 to 68, the Non-Proliferation Treaty was actually quite quickly negotiated. This had to do with the fact that the Johnson administration felt heavily pressured by the scene in Vietnam, was eagerly trying to create what we call a foreign policy coup, and reaching a non-PT with the Soviets seemed like a good idea. They did not view it as a low-hanging fruit by any means. The NPT was seen as the jewel in the crown of non-proliferation efforts, not as a low-hanging fruit. As negotiation progressed, we see the, if you will, the birth of the nuclear test benchmark. And I'm quoting from Article 6, Section 3 of the NPT. For the purpose of this treaty, a nuclear weapon state is one which has manufactured and exploded a nuclear weapon or other nuclear explosive device prior to Jan 1st, 67. This is essentially the birth of the nuclear test benchmark in the NPT. It's also important to understand where the definitions came from. Initially, there was no agreed upon deadline. And the British representatives and other representatives complained about that. And they basically pointed to a scenario where a country like Pakistan in 98 or India in 98 could test and then ask to join a treaty which does not have a deadline for the manufacture and explode definition. So the deadline was added as January 1st, 67. A deadline which by the time that this definition was accepted, October 31st had passed already, right? So they're referring to something, an event that has already passed. Nuclear weapon states, in the terminology itself was amended. The main campaigner for this amendment was actually the Indians. They said, hey, we plan on being a nuclear state. We're planning to develop our own civil nuclear infrastructure. You should be sure that whichever term you use will only single out weapons. So this was accepted as well. Interestingly enough, the term nuclear weapon or device, the one which is used in the treaty, was not defined, even though if you backtrack and if you follow the memos and the protocols themselves, you see that the delegates did in fact intend on defining it, but eventually it was not defined, which is interesting, and we can talk about any possible loopholes arising from that. The gradually universal acceptance of the NPT led to a very interesting and problematic conceptual, if you say hurdle, or I think we can refer to it as a sort of a conceptual fuzzy logic. If we fully adopt the nuclear test benchmark as a benchmark for weapons possession, we basically get a warped sense of reality and what possession or the development or the acquirement of nuclear weapons mean. And there are, in the literature, if we follow it, there are clear historical examples. For example, a lack of test is obviously no indication of a no capability, and it's enough to just go and examine the history of, a little boy being employed in Hiroshima to see the fallacy in that. You have an untested device being deployed without ever being tested. And that's just, history 101. Sorry, questions? I should probably mention that the only nuclear test was conducted on the plutonium device, which was called the Gadget, and it was the device which was tested. Second-generation proliferators are also a very clear example of the problem with using a lack of nuclear tests as an indication of no capability. In the literature, second-generation proliferators are referred to as a group of states, 4 states, which have developed nuclear capabilities between the mid-60s and the end of the Cold War. This group consists namely of Israel, Pakistan, South Africa, and India, and you see photos of the relevant leaders here on the PowerPoint presentation. I'm actually going to talk more about Pakistan and South Africa here as a case of nuclear learning. On the other hand, if we consider this fuzzy logic of using nuclear tests as a benchmark, we clearly see the fallacy in the case of India. India conducted what it termed a peaceful nuclear explosion in May 1974, Smiling Buddha. India in 74 was 20 years removed from developing a workable nuclear arsenal, so clearly the execution of a nuclear test could not, likelihood be construed as same as possession of a working nuclear arsenal. So we see that in most cases, our benchmark is somewhat accurate, but in the, let's say, in the fringe cases, we have a conceptual program with using it and with adapting it. So we need to figure out, conceptually speaking, what is the role of the nuclear test benchmark. I'm now going to touch relatively shortly on the Israeli angle of the story. Most of it, or some of it at least, was covered by Eitan, and some of it was covered by Zoe, so I'm not going to expand very much. But even if we go only to the documented history of the nuclear dimension of US-Israeli talks, the role of nuclear tests is significant, and it also helps to codify the norms that we allocate to the NPT in this respect. One of the famous documents relates to the Warneke-Rabin conversation, talks, discussions, which were held in October and November 68. This is just after the Six-Day War, just before Johnson is about, he's not going to lose the election himself. The Democratic Party is about to lose the election, and Nixon is about to be voted in as president. And very, very shortly, Israeli ambassador to Washington, Yitzhak Rabin, and Israeli head of the Air Force, Moti Hod, they meet with Paul Warneke and US diplomats, and they talk about how to interpret Israel's formulation of no first introduction. And Rabin says that as far as his, or Israel, because Rabin is an ambassador, is concerned, an unadvertised, untested nuclear device is not a nuclear weapon, and this goes into the protocol as one formulation. Moti Hod adds introduction of a weapon could only mean after testing, so the equation here is quite clear, and this is before the fateful September 1969 meeting. Following the fateful September 1969 meeting, and this is before knowledge or awareness of the meeting percolates inside the American administration to lower branches, we see another very interesting, documented evidence of the importance of nuclear tests specifically, and the linkage to the role in the NPT, at least in how Israel sees it. And this is before Israel gives the official notice that it's not going to join the NPT, notice which takes place a few months later, officially. So Rabin here again, in the capacity of the ambassador, meets State Department officials. These officials are not in the know in terms of anything that took place between Mayer and Nixon. And he says something which he knows will be in the protocol, and he minces his words very carefully, and I think it's important to, and that's why I also pasted the exact text here. It says, "It is the view of the government of Israel that introduction means the transformation from a non-nuclear weapon country into a nuclear weapon country." And here you see that he's self-censoring. He wants to be very specific because he knows this will be on the record, and someone crazy in Tel Aviv in 2018 will show it on a PowerPoint and discuss it. He says, Ambassador Rabin elaborated on the foregoing only to the extent of noting that response in paragraph 2 conformed to the language used in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. This is a very specific linkage using the nuclear test benchmark and linking it to the NPT as far as Israel is concerned. And so I find these documents very important in paving the way, but they weren't only important to Israel, they were also largely accepted by the international community as such. In the 1970s and throughout the 1980s, we see two very important nuclear actors who basically adapt and learn from what they perceive and what they see as Israel's nuclear experience and Israel's nuclear handling of its relationship with the US, and they adopt it and they use the developed understanding of the role of nuclear tests in their relationship with the US. The first actor is Pakistan. This is Pakistani President Zia-ul Haq, who came to power in the late 1970s in Pakistan in a coup. And the other country we're going to talk about briefly is South Africa. This is Pik Botha, who was the famous South African foreign minister throughout the let's say, from roughly the entire 1980s, and I'm not sure, I don't remember exactly when he was sworn in at some point in the late 1970s, but he was the point person in talks with the US, and you see him meeting President Reagan here. So as far as Pakistan was concerned, it was following Israel-US relations closely. Obviously, Pakistan does not have diplomatic relations of its own with Israel. It was generally doing what I and you guys generally do. It read newspapers and it read academic research papers, and it was trying to analyze the role of Israel's nuclear program and its relations with the US without knowing anything that had to do with the content of Nixon's and Mayor's talk in September 69. And the way Pakistan construed Israeli-US relations in the 1970s was as follows. Nuclear tests and their removal from the international agenda are important to the US. The US wants to refrain from embarrassment. For the US, if an ally who isn't supposed to conduct a nuclear test or to develop a nuclear weapon capability, if such an ally conducts a nuclear test, it's a major embarrassment, it's a major hurdle, and the US is probably willing to bargain a few chips to make sure that this eventuality does not happen. So some of the documents, I think I only pasted 2 short clippings from the documents. I work to substantiate these claims, but these 2 I find the most relevant ones. So one of them, this quote is in a memo from Secretary of State George Shultz, just before Reagan's slotted meeting with President Zia in December '82. And this is what Shultz writes. He says, "Last year we received assurances from Zia that Pakistan would not embarrass us on the nuclear issue." And the 3 dots here is where he says, while it's getting aid from us, which is very important. We both understood this clearly to mean that Pakistan would not test a nuclear device. It was left ambiguous as to what it means short of a test. So this whole realm of activity which creeps up, which crawls into the area of a nuclear test, is left rather ambiguous, and it's not clear what Pakistan is supposed or not supposed to do, but it definitely is not supposed to conduct a nuclear test. Pakistan also guaranteed that it wouldn't conduct other nuclear activities. It violated the other guarantees. It did enrich uranium. It did conduct certain nuclear activities which it was not supposed to do. The one thing it stuck to during the Cold War was not testing, the no testing guarantee. And also, if you follow some of the memos which followed the Reagan-Zia meeting, and you see a photo from that here, in one of the memos, a US diplomat states very clearly to Zia, to the Pakistanis, the US would be obligated to terminate security assistance if Pakistan assembles or tests a nuclear device. Now, of course, we have to remember that the US would not know if Pakistan assembled a nuclear device, but it was sure as hell no if Pakistan tested a nuclear device. We're in the late 80s here. So this is a very central element in US-Pakistani relations. The second leg of this story has to do with South Africa. This is a photo from the May 1981 meeting between Pik Botha and Reagan. We all have to remember that South Africa at that time was under heavy pressure from the entire world to moderate its racist apartheid regime. And the nuclear-related sanctions were only a part of the international campaign to curtail apartheid. They were less focused on South Africa's nuclear activities per se and were perceived as a part of a larger campaign. It's also important to remember that, probably quite similar to the Pakistani case, South Africa was pivotal to the US in the sense that it had a very high significance in terms of its geostrategic locations. The Reagan administration was very much preoccupied with how to block what it perceived was Soviet expansionism. This expansionism took place in Afghanistan, where the US cooperated with Pakistan to block the Soviet, on the one hand. It also existed in the sub-Saharan African sphere, where the Reagan administration was very much interested in blocking what it perceived to be Soviet expansionism. So they were not eager to chuck South Africa and the relationship with South Africa into the trash bin. They wanted to sustain bits of it, and they adopted policies which shaped that line of thinking. And here's an interesting thing. So, like Pakistan is the South Africans also followed US-Israeli relations quite closely in the 1970s. Arguably, they had more to use other than just newspaper clippings and watching the news. They probably had better grasp, better understanding of the depth of the relationship. And they also thought that it would be a good idea to use the nuclear test as bargaining chip in their relationship with the US. They did it in a somewhat different manner. The South Africans managed to convince the French to sell them a nuclear power plant, a civilian nuclear power plant. It's located in Koeberg, just near Cape Town. The Americans were making sure that the French would not supply the relevant nuclear fuel elements for Koeberg, and the South Africans knew that once the plant would be operational, they would actually not be able to fuel it, and they were very much interested in convincing the Reagan administration to greenlight it. I'll spoil the story. The Reagan administration did greenlight it. They phoned the French and they told the French, you can send them the fuel elements, and this is what happened. But I'm going to backtrack 2 steps here. When Pik Botha comes to meet Reagan, it's very important for him to first of all make sure that he and Reagan are on the same page in terms of South Africa not acceding to the NPT. And it's also very important for him to make sure that the Reagan administration greenlights this fuel shipment I just mentioned. And when I interviewed Pik Botha about the meeting he had with Reagan, this is the formulation he told me of the pitch he made to Reagan. He said, I told President Reagan that such a device, and he's talking about a South African nuclear device here, such a device would never be exploded unless the US government is informed beforehand. He's basically offering a no surprise nuclear test guarantee. This is Pik Botha and the South African government's understanding of how they can bargain and leverage the US motivation to refrain from embarrassing nuclear tests. I'm continuing the quote, so that the US government would be in a position to consider its actions and convey it to the South African government in advance. This has to do with the South African strategy of essentially using nuclear tests or the threat of nuclear tests to motivate US intervention in case of a serious threat coming from South Africa's northern borders. Let me remind you that in the 1980s we had Soviet-supported Cuban forces conducting a bush war there. So for South Africa this was important. The South Africans saw their own nuclear capability. Basically, that's the official version, though I can tell you that there's also an unofficial version. I can talk about it later. As far as they were concerned, nuclear tests were aimed, or the ability to conduct a nuclear test had a single aim, and that would be to threaten the US and to make sure the US would come to South Africa's aid should South Africa's national security be threatened. The official line is that South Africa never intended to be able to deploy these devices, and they were only developed so they would be able to test them. So in the South African case, you see a clear South African motivation to turn the ability to conduct a nuclear test into a no-surprise test guarantee vis-a-vis the Americans. Interestingly enough, apparently this was much more of a nuclear deal in the South African side than it was to the US. And I followed both protocols of these meetings. So in the South African protocol as taken by the South African ambassador, it's framed in the following words: the White House would be informed before any test. This is the essence of the deal. And Reagan was struck by this argument. He reiterated his commitment to change the policy on nuclear fuel. So obviously in the South African mind, this is an amazing achievement. But if you follow Al Haig's memo, and Haig was the Sec of State at the time, this is just before he's kicked out of office and replaced, for trying to usurp Reagan when Reagan was shot. Different story. So Haig writes a very detailed 2-page memo which touches on everything other than the specific bargain we just mentioned. And the last line in the last page says, on the nuclear front, we promise that we will make a best effort on fuel supply for the reactors within the legal constraints. So this is not the same story. But for the South Africans, again, the meeting and the no surprise test guarantee was a pivotal moment in the relation, though somewhat single-sided. I'm going to wrap up in the following point. It was mentioned here before that North Korea just, I believe it was in the weeks preceding the June 13th summit between President Trump and Supreme Leader Kim, North Korea declared that it would not conduct a nuclear test. We all know this is a very soft statement. It's not backed up by joining a treaty. It's just a statement. It's nice. It's a nice to have statement, but I don't think anyone takes it. We all take it with a grain of salt. We all know that CTBTO reps were not present when the site was demolished, etc. The interesting question here is, will we see North Korea moving into this no-test model where it expects the US to live with its arsenal as long as it's not tested? I think it's a possibility we can discuss somewhat further. I'm going to end here. Thank you very much.
Any questions for Or? Okay, so yes, I do have one, and I'd like to listen to either Dr. Rabinowitz and Mr. Bernardi comment on this as well. And actually, I'm not sure what I'm asking addresses today's advances in technology and the ability to process big data. So it doesn't make the CDB redundant in some way. What I'm saying is that you don't need to be.
I think I got your question. So that's a very interesting point. At a time when police departments have started to use big data and application to try to anticipate where crime is going to happen, you could anticipate something like this, saying, okay, so you just monitor internet traffic and big data, and you will find out who did the test and where in a minute. So indeed, there's a lot of information that is becoming available, but and we should see the potential of big data to improve what we have already as part of the verification regime, rather than fantasizing on basically getting the solution on the internet and automatically, because what the CTBT provides is, first of all, trustworthy data. So these are data that are produced by systems that meet rigorous specifications that have been established in a transparent way and shared with all member states, meaning that everybody knows where the data are coming from and what are the specifications of the stations and how the data are being processed at the International Data Center, to a point that we can reproduce the results of the organization. Yeah.
I was talking about capacity building of the state. I mean, is it necessary today to conduct a nuclear test? Is it still relevant when a certain country can just process it like using computers, stuff like that, or is it still?
Okay, so yeah, I got it from the relevance of the verification, because indeed there's a lot of discussion on using big data to improve the verification system. As you know, Dr. Rabinowitz presented, so there are cases in the history where nuclear weapons were used and they were not tested before. But what we know is that in order to be 100% sure, if you want to have a reliable weapon system, you need to go through this phase of testing. So it pretty much depends on what you want to use your weapon or your device for. If it's for military application, you need to go through the phase of testing to have the guarantee that you will have this capability should you have the need to deploy it. So you can have the the best designs and available and so on. To go to the step of getting a reliable weapon, you will need to go through a testing phase. But it's true that with access to data and the base of technology, the way we exchange information and so on. This is a risk to proliferation. I don't know if you want to comment on this.
I think the answer would, so I agree with the points that you made here. We can only follow some, let's say, very general rule of thumb. So, for example, in the literature, it's commonly stated that simple first-generation weapons don't necessarily have to be tested because the design is so ancient and has been proven before that. If you're developing a very simple first-generation design, you're not necessarily going to feel a very tremendous urge to test it. Again, it depends on the country, it depends on the level of sophistication of the scientific establishment. So the most common example is South Africa. In the 1980s, the South African scientists were confident enough to develop their untested design, but it wouldn't be exactly the same with Pakistan, for example. But again, these are very generalizations and more complicated designs, and would definitely change the picture.
Okay, so if there are no any further questions, I suggest we take a break, unless some questions. Okay.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Years ago, the Palestinian territory wanted to have a status of observer in the Protocol Committee. And although the procedure allow an observer only if there is a nuclear installation on its soil or is relevant to the treaty, still many states support it. I think that eventually not passed, but many states support it. They support it, although it clearly violates the procedure, meaning that they were willing to pass the procedure for political reasons. What do you have to say about it regarding what will be the future if indeed Israel is inside?
Again, my first response to that is to use the same argument as I mentioned before, the distinction between the Preparatory Commission and the treaty, the CTBT. There are rules of procedure that pertain to the treaty itself. When you read it, that we did not have in the resolution establishing the Preparatory Commission, so which makes the distinction between the situation today and what is supposed to happen after entry into force. But the observership status is defined in the rules of procedures of the PropCom that were established by the PropCom itself. So meaning the PropCom has the power to make decisions, but in the rules of procedures that were established, there were some conditions, as you mentioned, and being a host of an international monitoring facility, for instance, and is one of the criteria that would facilitate membership status, or clear recognition as a state is another one. I have to admit that I was not privy to all the discussion that took place at that time, but I would re-stress the main difference between the Preparatory Commission and its rules of procedures and what should have to happen after entry into force of the treaty.
Fine, so we'll take a break of 15 minutes. Back, so we're heading toward the end of our panel with one more speaker. The speaker will be Mr. Avri Avital from the Israeli Atomic Energy Commission Policy Division. Please.
Thank you. First, allow me to thank the organizing team for this important discussion and for inviting me to present the Israeli policy regarding the CTBT. I think it's obvious that we welcome the open discussion and the academic dialogue. One more important thing to say, I think the CTBT youth group is a relatively new and impressive initiative that I think demonstrates the long-term vision of the CTBTO leadership. I was honored to meet with a few members of the Israeli branch, some of them are not here attending today, from the group, and I was very impressed. by the work and especially by the enthusiasm. So thank you for that. In my brief talk this evening, I will elaborate on the long-standing Israeli policy towards the CTBT and I'll briefly describe Israel's considerations for ratification of the treaty. A good chance to thank Dr. Barak for his presentation, giving kind of a line and overview of what has been in the past. At the opening, I think it's important to say that Israel views the CTBT as a very important cornerstone of the international non-proliferation regime. From its early negotiations phase in the CD in Geneva, Israel supported the CTBT and was one of the first countries to sign the treaty in September 1996. And it's also important to state that Israel signed the treaty with a clear intention to ratify it. Our support since then have been demonstrated through full participation in the work of the CTBT or PEPCOM and support of the build-up of the verification regime, as was stated before by a few distinguished colleagues. This support includes operating the National Data Center, the Sorek Nuclear Research Center in Yavne, established 1994, Sorek personnel, e.g. scientists, analysts, and technical experts, is operating the data center and responsible for data retrieval and analysis. In addition, they're responsible for continuous data transmission to the IDC 24/7, 365 days a year, and that's unlike other states in the region, as I will specify later on. Operating two IMS auxiliary seismic stations, as Dr. Barak rightly said, in Mount Meron and in Mount Amram, right next to Eilat, and 6 Israeli seismic stations as CNFs, cooperating national facilities. In addition, there's an operation of a CTBTO certified radionuclide laboratory at Sorek, a laboratory that meets the highest standards required by the CTBTO and is included in its network of 16 laboratories worldwide. The support also includes maintaining an active role in the build-up of the OSI, the on-site inspection element of the verification regime, by ongoing participation in workshops, tabletop and field exercises, etc. As Dr. Grenard mentioned before, Israel also hosted an OSI major workshop, the brief workshop, to follow up and identify lessons learned from the OSI integrated field exercise, the IFE 14, that was held in Jordan. This support also includes an active part in the deliberations of the 2 working groups, as well as the biannual meetings of the Preparatory Commission. And last, Israel is also paying in full its annual financial contributions to the CTBTO, which usually is supposed to be almost funny to hear from a former representative who says that his state is paying his annual fees, but this is unlike other states in the region, and this is why I'm stating this fact. Israel is represented at the CTBTO via its permanent mission to the IAEA and the CTBTO PEPCOM, and it works in complete coordination with the IUC policy division in the headquarters. When touching regional challenges, I think it's important that when discussing arms control and non-proliferation initiatives and treaties, I think the poor regional track record shows that adherence and compliance are unfortunately not a leading principle in the Middle East. This goes back to what Dr. Granat said about same obligations, same rights of the treaty, and it goes back to, or refers to what Dr. Dvornik referred to as norms, which in the Middle East is different from the rest of the world. And despite high hopes, some regional states signed arms control treaties, such as the NPT, but had violated them. It's Libya, Iran, Syria, and Iraq. And they did so by developing or even using WMD capabilities during the years. And one cannot turn a blind eye on such a negative history of disregarding legal and political obligations. In this regard, there are unfortunate examples from recent years in our region. The first one is the Iranian behavior of deception and misleading, despite being a member of the NPT and despite being a party to the JCPOA. I think that the nuclear archive that was revealed earlier this year by Israel was yet another proof of the Iranian poor record of fulfilling commitments. The second example is despite the fact that Syria signed and ratified the CWC, it repetitively used chemical weapons against its own civilians. And with the nuclear issue, the situation is not better, where Syria covered construction of a heavy water reactor with DPRK assistance that was designed to produce plutonium in 2007. This was in complete violation of its commitments under the NPT. And I remind all of us that this issue is still pending, and Syria refuses to cooperate with the IAEA on the matter. Moreover, some states in the region which signed the CTBT are not fulfilling their commitments and obligations accordingly, and are far from what we will call and wish full cooperation with the CTBTO. Regarding the Israeli ratification of the treaty, well, as it's been said before, it's not a question of if, but rather a question of when. And the main consideration for an Israeli ratification are mainly three considerations. The first is the equal status of the policy-making organs of the treaty. The second is the completion of the verification regime and the OSI element. And this has close connection to the abuse issue that Dr. Barak mentioned before. And the third is the regional security consideration. Regarding the equal status in the policy-making organs, I think that, as it been discussed before, due to the opposition of one member of the MESA, the Middle East and South Asia group, which is the regional group that Israel belongs to according to the treaty definition that we all know found in Annex 1, the group has not been functioning for over 20 years. And all members of the group are prevented from taking a role in the policy-making organs. This is an Iranian bullying of 23 states that are unable to even meet as a group. And regarding the changes that, the differences between the EC and the PrepCom that Dr. Granad mentioned before, you hear during the discussions the Iranian call for changing this list and this format, the format of the group. So this is also something that we should take in consideration. The second consideration is the completion of the verification regime and the OSI element. The challenges for the verification regime of the treaty in the Middle East are significant ones. There are still significant gaps in the coverage of the IMS network in the region and in the lack of continuous data transmission to the IDC. There are 3 states in the region that did not fulfill their obligations under the treaty and not completing their IMS station building and data transmission. In my view, and this goes back to what Dr. Barak mentioned before, this is a good example for a technical element which could have served as a confidence-building measure if countries had the willingness to do so. Regarding the regional security considerations, at times when arms control treaties are being violated by states of the region, and some international agreements are used to cover forbidden activities, Israel is considering very carefully every move. One cannot expect Israel to compromise its security considerations and to delink it from its regional atmosphere and mistrust in the Middle East. In addition, we're keeping an open eye on adherence and compliance to the treaty by states in the region. Extreme positions by some states in the Middle East, such as the Egyptian link between Israel joining the NPT and the ratification of the treaty by Cairo, will, in the end of the day, prevent the treaty from entering into force. And this is something we should bear in mind. All of these substantive considerations are and will be part of the Israeli assessment regarding future ratification of the CTBT. It's important to say that an Israeli ratification is not linked to any ratification of any other state. So it's almost, well, it's not true, any complaint that states this linkage that Israel does, because it's not. To sum up briefly, I will emphasize the strong message of Israel's support to the treaty and its willingness to advance the readiness of all verification regime elements. We enjoy great cooperation with the PTS, and we hope to continue strengthening this cooperation and can only hope that others in our region will do the same. Allow me to once again thank the organizing team for this important discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we open the discussion. Any questions, any remarks about all the presentations we heard today? Of course, one after the other. I can pick up questions and then the participants will be able to answer. Okay, yes.
My name is Maybe, and I'm dealing in nuclear incident, like especially the big one like Chernobyl, Fukushima, Fukushima. And I have two questions. One for Mr. Now, and one for Mr. Vital. Allow me to be more practical on this side. If you can say a few words about what's the monitoring system all over the world, if the globe have some, spaces or places that we are like not as precise as we wanted to do in the global side. And for you, Mr. Vital, I would like to ask you if you can say a few words about like nuclear power plant in Israel in the electrical side, which means, but of course in concerning to what this conference is about. Like the treaty is giving reasons to or not to, because there will be some conflicts inside.
Okay, yes.
Okay, so I will start with the first question on the what I would summarize as the IMS coverage, so the International Monitoring System. I should start by saying that the system was designed at the time of the treaty negotiation to try to provide a coverage as homogeneous as possible, but mainly to be a deterrent to any potential violator of the treaty. And simply because of the structure of the Earth and the geophysics, and you simply cannot have this homogeneous coverage, because the northern hemisphere, for instance, has more land masses than the southern hemisphere. That's why the detection threshold in the northern hemisphere is much lower from a seismic point of view than in the southern hemisphere, for instance. Simply a matter of distribution of land masses. But that's the reason why we have more than one technology. And the purpose of having 4 technologies is to make sure that they work in synergy. And for instance, we have a threshold monitoring level in the southern hemisphere that is different than in the north for the seismic technology, but we have hydroacoustic stations in the southern hemisphere with hydrophone station extremely sensitive, as I mentioned before. And again, I use the case of the San Juan, or the case of a few kilograms of explosives that could be set off the coast of Japan, that can be detected 10,000 kilometers away by a station off the coast of Chile. So you combine seismic, hydroacoustic, and suddenly you see that you have a different picture. Then you add the infrasound as well, you have another one. But that's why you need to look at the global picture by using all technologies in synergy. If you point to a particular region of the world, it may be that some stations are missing, as mentioned by Avery in his presentation. Indeed, the IMS is designed to have more stations in place than what we have today, because there are still some stations to be constructed. But if we look at the global performance, you don't need to be that close to an event to make a detection. Again, DPRK test in 2017 detected by 122 stations. The whole world lit up, basically, when the test was carried out, with stations detecting the event in South America, in Colombia. So 10,000 kilometers away from DPRK, you get a nice detection. In the center of Africa, we have a big seismic array in Niger that is picking up the events. Going back to the question regarding the region, the Middle East, you do not need necessarily to have station in the Middle East to monitor. So you have good seismic coupling, and you get other stations, be it in Africa, in Turkmenistan, and elsewhere, that provide excellent coverage. But indeed, there is some redundancy already built into the IMS, and we would be better off with all stations constructed, because this is the way it was designed. But what we see is that with the evolution of the technology, we have already lowered the detection threshold as compared to what was initially expected during the treaty negotiation. So we are improving day after day the ability and to detect really minute radioactivity signals at the radionuclide stations, and the detection threshold is always going down. So year after year, the resolution of the system is improving as well. So despite the system not being complete, we already provide a pretty good coverage. There are some other elements that are simply related to the physics, and for instance, in the equatorial region of the globe, you don't have the same wind patterns as you would have in higher latitudes, and therefore infrasound signals would not travel as far away. As I mentioned before, you would not expect infrasound or radionuclides in the atmosphere to travel great distance if you are close to the equatorial region. So it's not totally uniform, but the number of stations that we have and the redundancy that is already built in and the synergy between technologies provide a sufficient coverage.
Thank you. Just to add to what Mr. Grenard just said, I think one of the added challenges of just building the station is the data transmission. We take the Iranian case, in the end of a long process, they build the stations, but they stop transmitting, basic data from one point on. And that is a big challenge, because there are coverage, but in reality, it's a big lack, and it's an important and problematic area that those stations are needed. About your second questions to me, I'll be happy for if you can explain it a bit better, because I didn't get.
Yeah, I'm talking about the nuclear power plant.
Mm-hmm.
So Israel doesn't have it.
Mm-hmm.
The research nuclear, etc. All over the world, numbers against and for
Mm-hmm.
nuclear, but I know that some aspects with the treaty is like going well together. In common on this.
I'm not finding any connection between the two. So the nuclear reactors, power nuclear reactors, are producing and functioning almost with no connection to the treaty. I mean, beside noble gas and different aspects, but as a whole, and the basis assumption is there's no connection between the two.
Small question too. Since you mentioned Iran and the suspension of data, upon his 2016 visit, I will speak without. Upon his visit in June 2016, the secretary, he was asked about that problem that Iran suspended, and he replied that north of Iran in Turkmenistan we have completed a station, and it should fill the gap. What is the approach of the committee regarding this? Is it addressed your concern?
Well, the Iranian challenge regarding the treaty goes on all levels of interest, the political levels and the technical levels. The Iranian behavior or way of doing business in the treaty, they're very active. And they're challenging a lot of basic principles of the treaty, but that's another discussion. Technically, if we discuss the issue of that same station, there's an issue of how certain you are. Where was the test? The exact point of it, the exact location, what was the process, what was the level of its, many questions which are completely different than just knowing the fact that it was a test. That's first. And second, it's a basic obligation that Iran is not fulfilling. So beside the technical question of if you'll know there is an experiment in Iran or not, there's a basic need for all states to cooperate, what I just referred in my presentation as full cooperation. This is what needed. And for now, as you just heard about the stations and data transmission, this is missing.
Yes, please.
Yes, couple of comments. On the data transmission, indeed, we expect state signatories to the treaty to cooperate as much as they can to help with the build-up, the development of the system. But having said that, data transmission is not an obligation at this stage. And this is something that was decided by the Preparatory Commission that created particular conditions for the transmission of the data. It becomes an obligation when the treaty enters into force, because then it's a treaty obligation. But until the treaty enters into force, indeed for the purpose of testing, development, and so on, this is where we expect states to contribute data with data availability as high as possible to help with the development. But there are some caveats in what the Preparatory Commission has approved, and saying that for a particular reason, constitutional reason, whatever, there are ways, basically, that are possible for state to avoid transmitting data to the international data center. So we are doing our utmost to really encourage state to participate in the exchange of data, because we believe it's to the benefit of the PrepCom, to the benefit of all state signatories, but it's not a legal obligation until the treaty enters into force. I think it's important to make this distinction, because it goes back to one of the points I was making today, is that we cannot simply say that we enjoy the fruits of the IMS. So if there's a nuclear test, you get data and so on, and therefore there is no need for the treaty to enter into force. With no treaty, there's no obligation to transmit data. So everything is on very fragile foundations. With no entry into force of the treaty, there is no on-site inspection. So all those mechanisms that we have discussed cannot be invoked until the treaty has entered into force. That's why there are good reasons to move to the next stage, because right now it's not a legal obligation to transmit data. On the question on the nuclear power plant, although indeed this is not part of the mandate of the organization to look into the peaceful use of nuclear energy. This is for others to deal with. But since you mentioned your role in the preparation for response in case of nuclear emergencies, that's probably where the organization has a role to play, because in the follow-up to the Fukushima accident, where we were the only organization in the world able to provide calibrated, trustworthy data on the radioactive concentration of materials that were propagating around the Earth. After Fukushima, we joined the IACRANE, this is the Interagency Committee for Radiological and Nuclear Emergencies, whereby in case of a nuclear accident, we would provide data to the IAEA, that is a secretariat of that organization, on request from IAEA. And we have signed a practical arrangement with IAEA to provide data in case of an accident. So that's where I could see a link. It's not directly, again, in our mandate, as you mentioned, but there's probably a potential user for data in the case of a nuclear emergency. Thank you.
Thank you. Any further questions from the audience? Okay, so I have just one question for Patrick. Regarding the relations between Egypt and Israel in the context of arms control, how far or dissimilar are the viewpoints of Egypt and Israel toward the implication of this treaty, the CTBTO, and also generally about arms control? Because as we know, in recent years, Israel and Egypt made some serious steps of cooperation on strategic matters regarding regional developments. But on this point, is there any change in what Egypt thinks should come first from the Israeli side and the relations between the states?
So it's really hard for me to comment on national positions that really belong to member states themselves and to their own consideration, their own perception of their security environment. But what I generally sense, and it's not only Egypt, Israel, but it could be within even more countries, is that there's no opposition to the CTBT. And often when we discuss, and there seems to be a general agreement that we should all move to a point where the CTBT enters into force. Then there are different ways of moving to that point, and some say that they don't want to build their stations until there's more clarity on entry into force or prospects for entry into force. Others says, I want ratify the treaty if the others are not building the station. So it becomes really at the end I would say a rather complex and conditional systems, and you could really debate that at length because everybody could come with the conditions. But what I wanted to stress today is that this is a discussion that can take place when you have time. If you have the luxury of time, you can really aim at the best time to do things, and you can have time to put as many considerations as possible. But what I see is that the clock is ticking, and I'm not sure that we will have this luxury of time. And for I would say for a long time, given the environment and the raising expectations for progress in the disarmament and non-proliferation area, and as I was mentioning, some states now coming to question basically what we have achieved so far, because the IMS is working. Yeah, there may be a few stations that remain to be built, and we have some issues with data transmission. Some states are even transmitting data, then they stop, and then they resume. But overall, we have a functioning system. But now we see more and more some states coming and questioning the whole issue and saying, if there's no prospects for entry into force of the treaty, let's put some conditions. And those countries who have ratified the treaty will get more benefits than others who have not ratified. I'm not saying it's the right thing to do. These are messages that we start getting from some member states, and this is new in the landscape of the preparatory commission. So I believe that it's true that states have to focus on their national security, environment, and their own consideration, that I would refrain from commenting, but the messages that I get at the same time is that there's not a luxury of time to do it.
Thank you. Okay, so if there are not any other questions, I'll give the right of speech to Nir. And Okay, the members of, the youth group of the city BTO, please.
Hello. I'm going to keep this short and sweet like myself. So my name is Adi. I was born in Israel and grew up in Canada. I joined the CTBTO youth group this past spring. My first event as part of the youth group was to attend the Science and Diplomacy Symposium in Vienna that took place at the United Nations for 2 weeks. So the CTBT youth group was founded in 2016 when they kind of realized that a lot of people who are youth, and by the way, we have a very loose definition of youth, we don't have a set age group for that. So for example, I was born the year the CTBT was signed, and and therefore a lot of people our age, don't really know what exactly the CTBT is or why it's important. So the aim of the youth group is kind of to get people involved, to get people to care, to get people to know what it is. So I joined the youth group this past spring, and I joined the youth group coordination team following the conference. So as part of the coordination team, there's a coordinator from each annex to non-ratifying state. So Baruchi, our Israeli coordinator, is doing his PhD in the US, so he's not here right now. But I serve as the communications coordinator, which means that I make the newsletter and send it out to the 550 plus youth group members we have from all over the world. And the coordination team this past August and September got to travel to Kazakhstan, and along with Lucina Serbo and some other very interesting, insightful people. So in Kazakhstan, we got to visit the nuclear test site where the Soviets tested, I think it was 456 nuclear bombs. We got to go to ground zero to apparently where the first one was. And that was morbid, but very, very interesting. And I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have gone and done that. So an upcoming event for people who would like to join the youth group, there's the SNT conference. You can find out more information on those tables. That's coming up in June. So there's a call for proposals if you would like to speak or have a poster presented. I believe the deadline for that is January 31st. So that's taking place in Vienna at the end of June. And there are some of these flyers that you can find over there as well if you would like to get involved. We also have a website, and if you Google CTBTO Youth, you should be able to find it. We have Twitter as well. So it's been really interesting to be a part of it. And I don't know if you have any questions, but the youth group is really nice because Nir and Zoe are part of it as well, obviously, and then they're mostly the people who made this event happen. We have youth group members from, I think, every country on earth except for North Korea, but I could be wrong. Like I said, there's 550 plus members. At our Vienna conference where I met Zoe, the Middle Eastern members decided to create a side panel for youth. So we had us presenting about why Israel is signed but is not ratified and obstacles into entry into force and such. And we also had an Iranian delegation. There were 3 of them who presented about like the Iranian version of what I just spoke about. And then we also had a Libyan delegate who explained because Libya has signed and ratified, but that was complicated within itself. So anyways, that was really, really insightful and gave us the opportunity, as Israelis to meet people from different places that we wouldn't necessarily otherwise meet and communicate with and find common ground. So that was really interesting.
Thank you, Adi.
Adi didn't tell you that she grew up in Canada, so she has this perfect English. Thank you very much, Adi. Thank you very much. Thank all of you. Thank you for coming. Thank you for staying. Thank you so much, Mr. Grenard and Lisa, for traveling here from France. From France? I'm sorry.
Austria.
Yeah. Yeah. So thank you for taking the time and for sharing your thoughts. And to all of you, thank you so much, Avri. Yaron, Eitan, and Zoe. It was super interesting. I will, and oh, of course, I'm sorry. I will share with you the video for this conference for distribution. I think would be a great opportunity to distribute it and to disseminate it to as many people as we can. And thank you so much. Have a good night.